Delighted to be joined right now by Matthew Goodwin. He's not just an academic and a pollster, he's also author of one of the UK's biggest Substacks, mattgoodwin.org. It's just a great read, I have to say. Good morning to you, Matthew.
Good morning, Julia. How are you doing?
Very well indeed. Great to have you on the show. Really appreciate you joining us. So much to talk about. I mean, first up, I know you've been a keen Brexiteer. Keir Starmer saying it's time to turn a corner on Brexit and reset Britain's relationship with the EU. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I think it's going to make a lot of leavers in the country pretty nervous, especially when they look at the detail of the story in the Times today, which hints again at more migration as part of this deal. They hint at free movement for under 30-year-olds from across Europe amid record levels of legal migration. Some people in the government have obviously toned that bit down, but others have said actually the government is going to have to relent on that concession. And I think for lots of people, this taps into what they saw yesterday with the big speech in the Rose Garden, which is essentially, can we really trust this guy? Does he actually understand the mood of the country? Because this is, remember, the same man who said, we need to have a second referendum on Brexit. We need to ask the people to vote again because he didn't really like the decision the first time around. And I think there is a nervousness around the Labour government, which, remember, doesn't have it's funny to say given the size of the majority, but doesn't have a particularly strong public mandate when you look at the share of the overall vote. And Keir Starmer's ratings already, Julia, are collapsing in the national polls. They're down 28 points since he came into power.
I mean, that's an extraordinary thing, isn't it? I mean, for him to we get with this huge majority of over 400 MPs, and and you think on the face of it, it looks like this landslide, and it just wasn't. It was a bunch of Tory voters staying at home or voting for reform. But this is the thing: the speech yesterday was so downbeat, it was so pessimistic, and they were told it's setting the scene ahead of this October budget, where they're going to be terrible decisions that have to be made. Apparently they're forced on the government to have a tax rises, largely on those who apparently got broader shoulders, the middle classes, who were, by the way, already paying all of the taxes. But it was very, very downbeat. It was like, there's nothing to do with us, Gov. We didn't support lockdown or helping Ukraine, and we didn't support mad energy policies that got us into a point where we were so badly hit by Ukraine being invaded and the impact on energy prices around the world. Just a total, this has just happened out of the blue. We found out about it on July the 5th when we got into power, and now we're going to have to do all these awful things, but we're going to, he said, fix the foundations. That was what was written on the podium. In what way are they going to fix the foundations? By just raising everyone's taxes?
Yeah, I think lots of people will have struggled with the speech yesterday. I found it very depressing. I found it very bleak, very pessimistic. And there were some remarkable things that he actually said when you go back and look at the text. He basically said, again, like he did during the riots, much of the country is sort of mindless thugs. He even used the word, there is no, the idea there was legitimate protest is a pretense. He basically said everything that he doesn't like in the country is a result of populism, which again is largely how he views the vote for Brexit. And then when you get to the economy, Julia, what I found remarkable is he was sort of saying, well, look, we didn't know it was going to be this bad. Well, that's a lie, in my view, because we know that Paul Johnson and the Institute for Fiscal Studies was saying for a long time during the election campaign, both left and right are basically not being straight with you. Taxes are going to have to go up. Public spending is going to have to come down. So he's misleading the country on that. But also, Julia, I think many voters are scratching their heads today saying, well, hang on, if things are so tight, how come you could afford an inflation-busting pay rise for public sector workers? How come you can afford to absorb £5 to £7 billion a year on our broken asylum system while not putting forward any serious plan? How come David Lammy can find £100 million to give to other countries because he thinks, which in a sort of lunacy idea, that will stop migration into Britain? All these choices basically reflect the political choices that Keir Starmer and the Labour government are making, and they're not the choices, Julia, that actually most people want to see. Just one last point, if I may. There's one word Keir Starmer did not mention at all in his speech yesterday, which also happens to be the most important issue facing the country today, according to British voters in all of the polling, and that word, of course, is immigration. He didn't mention the broken borders. He didn't mention the small boats. He didn't mention net legal migration at 650,000 plus. So it's like he's tone deaf to what voters want to talk about. And I think that's the thing about Starmer that makes me so nervous, the kind of lawyer, technocrat, manager, but somebody who is completely disconnected from what ordinary people are thinking and feeling.
Well, absolutely. And again, that ties into what he was quite happy to willing to do as shadow Brexit secretary from 2016 to 2019, trying to get Jeremy Corbyn elected as Prime Minister of this country, which, I think there's some big question marks about that. There were plenty of Labour people who walked away because they knew that he was unfit for public office, of anti-Semitism and all the other issues. But also someone who basically worked, 24/7 to undermine a democratic vote for Brexit, to try and orchestrate a second referendum and, basically undo Brexit before it even happened. He's claimed to have accepted it since. The Labour manifesto, we're not going to, undo Brexit and things like. But the reality is there are plenty of ways they can undermine it, and they will try to undermine it, because he doesn't actually trust that the British people made the right decision. And the reason why he's a massive supporter of bodies like the EU, these supranational, bureaucratic, technocratic organisations, is because of that fundamental belief, which now pervades the whole of the so-called progressive left, which is that the people are a bit too ignorant and bigoted to make decisions for themselves. We need to let the technocrats, the clever people like us, make the decisions for them. And that's what it all comes down to.
Well, I think the most interesting answer Keir Starmer ever gave in an interview is when he was asked, what do you like most, Westminster or Davos? And he said Davos. And I think in a way that reflected what we're talking about, which is there is a section of the political elite that derives its sense of legitimacy and authority not from the people, not from the principle of popular sovereignty, which is ultimately what delivered things like Brexit, what delivered Boris Johnson's majority, among other things. But they derive their legitimacy and status from other elites in supranational institutions. And that is clearly how Starmer, the lawyer, kind of views power. But also, Julie, I think it's how he views much of the rest of the country. And I would even go further in saying it's not that I think Keir Starmer isn't in touch with the country. I think that's true. I also think he doesn't particularly like a big part of the country.
No.
I think you saw that in the reaction to the riots and the protests. Everybody rejects criminality. Everybody rejects violence. Let's put the usual caveat in there. But those protests were also clearly about, as the polling shows, 2/3 of people saying those protests were about recent immigration policy. But he cannot bring himself to say, as he did after the Black Lives Matter protests, as many people on the left did after the 2011 riots, that there is a wider discontent here that needs to be addressed. He's just shut it down. He said yesterday, this is about Nazis.
Everyone's a thug, everyone's a bigot.
Etc. And this is where Labour are going to come unstuck, Julia, because the small boat numbers will continue to go up. We know that. There is no serious plan. Nobody in the National Crime Agency thinks Labour's going to solve this issue. Migration will stay at very high levels, and the economy is going to remain stagnant and very squeezed. This is a pretty disastrous political backdrop for a leader who also isn't really in touch with the country.
Indeed.
And the wheels are going to come off quite quickly.
Well, I mean, as you say, they're already coming off. And certainly, again, having a new leader coming into power, and all his major speeches so far have been, isn't everything dreadful? It's not really kind of the feel-good factor people were hoping for, even staunch Labour voters. But you mentioned the immigration figures. We've actually had 7 days with no Channel migrants making it to the UK, not because of the success of smashing the gangs, of course, Matt Goodwin, but simply because of the weather. But 526 Channel migrants arrived yesterday on a total of 8 boats. That takes the total under Keir Starmer's government so far to 6,246, 19,820 for the entire year. We're basically on track for where we were in 2023, which was lower than 2022, but still huge number of people coming to our shores, many of them without passports, able, physically young, for fighting age men. I mean, trying to ignore that as an issue and trying to pretend that that's not a concern for people over and above legal migration of people who do have the right to come to this country is not going to play well.
No, I mean, it's gaslighting the British people. That's basically what Yvette Cooper and Keir Starmer are doing. Yvette Cooper last week came out and said, well, they're going to deport 14,000. Well, I mean, who cares? We've had 132,000 people cross since 2018, nearly 20,000 this year. There is no deterrent for people to cross. They're going to give asylum to, I would estimate, around 50 to 60,000 people who have already entered the country illegally. Well, that's going to give a big, bold message to a lot of other people. Hey, if you just get into Britain, they will basically give you asylum. We don't have any meaningful way of dissuading people from risking their lives. And to be honest with you, as we saw in the speech yesterday, Julia, I just don't think Labour really do see this as a priority.
No, they don't see it as a problem.
But they don't, because, they have the progressive wing that are basically, they view borders as racist, basically. And then they have this kind of bureaucratic mindset in number 10, which isn't really prioritizing this issue. It wants to kind of, deal with the economy. It wants to kind of, deal with public sector pay. Yeah, but it doesn't view these cultural issues as being...
not just the cultural issues, but the economic cost, particularly also of mass legal migration. Matt, I'd love to talk to you all morning. We've got to leave it there. But Matthew Goodwin, an academic pollster, thanks so much for joining us. Do take a look at his Substack, mattgoodwin.org.